Every year, hundreds of people go missing inside of national parks and forests all over North America. Of those hundreds of missing people, there's always a few that are particularly strange, that there isn't a rational explanation for how they went missing or where they were discovered. One man named David Paulides, who's a former police detective, made it his mission to start investigating these strange disappearances. And after spending thousands of hours researching them, he saw that there were clusters of areas all over North America where lots of people were going missing under these strange circumstances, and no one was any bit closer to figuring out what happened to these people or why. David Paulides began compiling what he was finding about all these strange cases and putting them into a book series that he calls Missing 411. I went out and purchased all of them. There's like 9 books because I'm totally fascinated by the Missing 411 phenomenon, and I want to continue to read through all of the research that he's done and find some very interesting cases that I can share with you all on my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to focus on 3 stories that all come out of Colorado, and in each story, it's as if someone or something literally picked these people up and moved them great distances to places that they would not have been able to access on their own. But before we get into today's Missing 411 stories, if you're a fan of Missing 411 or just everything strange, dark, and mysterious, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all I post about, and I upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, I would encourage you to sneak into the like button's home and replace all of their family photos with pictures of Steve Buscemi. Also, please subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 1981, Maurice Doc Demetz was an 84-year-old man living in Colorado. He was a lifelong minister, had a PhD in theology. He also had a blood condition, and he had arthritis in his knees that made it almost impossible for him to walk without assistance. He had always been really passionate about topaz hunting. He would go to these sites where you could dig into the ground and look for these rocks. When you broke them open, you could potentially find topaz, and he loved doing that. Because of his knees and because of his blood condition, he needed someone to go with him, to walk him around to the different dig sites, and to help him get back into the car and drive him back to his house. Doc had a friend named David McSherry. He wound up being the primary guy that would go with Doc anytime he went topaz hunting. On April 29th, 1981, Doc decides he wants to go topaz hunting. So he calls up David, and they load up David's car, and they head off to Pike National Forest, which was a spot they had gone many times before. And they had this one area that they used to love going in particular called Devil's Head. Locals in the area claimed that that spot was actually haunted by evil spirits. But to Doc and to David, there was no indication that they bought into any of that, and they went there all the time. When they got there on April 29th at 10 a.m., they got out, they went to their favorite dig sites. David actually walked Doc down this hill to this one little clearing. Doc had a backpack with him full of the tools he used to dig out the different rocks. After David had walked Doc to this spot, David walked back up the hill towards their car and went about 50 yards away from where Doc was to his dig site. And over the next several hours, the two would work independent of one another, just digging for topaz. Periodically, David would look over and he'd make sure that he could see Doc and make sure Doc was okay. At 3:45 in the afternoon, David decides, all right, it's probably time to get going soon. And he pokes his head up and he looks in the direction of where Doc was supposed to be, and Doc's not there. He had just seen him about 15 minutes earlier, so he's not concerned. He knows it's only been a few minutes, and frankly, Doc can't really go anywhere. He can barely walk. And so he just kind of stands up and maybe tries to get a better look, and he's thinking, okay, maybe Doc stood up and got behind a tree to relieve himself, or maybe he kind of is just out of sight, and he starts walking down to the area to just go find Doc. But Doc isn't there, and neither is his backpack with all of his tools. And David's sitting there thinking, I guess Doc must have packed up and headed back to the car. But then David's thinking to himself, in order to go from this dig site up to the car, it means walking up a fairly steep embankment. And there's no way that Doc would have been able to do that without assistance. And so he's looking around the area thinking, is there any sign of something bad happening here? There's no blood, there's no sign of any sort of altercation that would have happened here. David certainly didn't hear anything going on near him. He didn't hear an animal attack or anything like that. So he thinks, okay, somehow he must have got up to the car. David walks up the embankment all the way to the car. Doc's not up there. David goes in the car and he starts honking the horn and yelling out for Doc. No response. As he's honking the horn, 3 motorists come down the road. They see David honking the horn, and so they say, hey, what's going on? David tells them, hey, I got my 84-year-old friend. I don't know where he went. He can't have gone far. Can you guys help me look for him? But after David and these motorists spend a couple of hours looking in this area and there's no sign of him, they end up calling the authorities. The police show up, and over the next week, there is this extensive search in this whole area that includes bloodhounds and hundreds of people. But despite this massive effort, nothing is ever found of Doc. He just vanishes. And so Doc's wife writes a letter to the governor of Colorado and just says, he can't have done this on his own. He can't have walked away on his own. Someone or something lifted him up and took him away. There was no response to this letter, and ultimately Doc's case was shut down. They stopped looking for him and assumed he had died. But when David Paulides looked into this case and featured the Doc DeMetz case on his documentary, they actually reopened the case. But as of right now, there's no new additional details about the whereabouts of Doc DeMetz. To this day, we don't know what happened to him. In 2014, Jim McGrogan was a 39-year-old medical doctor who was living in Indiana with his wife and his 2 kids. He was widely regarded as a very loving husband and devoted father, and everybody seemed to just love this guy. Jim was in phenomenal shape. He had run marathons, triathlons. He loved being in the outdoors, hiking, rock climbing, snowshoeing, skiing. That was Jim's happy place. And so in early March 2014, Jim decides he wants to plan a trip with some friends to go hiking in Colorado. And so he begins planning out where they're going to go hiking, and he finds this amazing trail right opposite the very famous Vail ski resort. Even though Jim was very competent in the outdoors, he would take a survival class and an avalanche preparedness class before he left for Colorado, just to show his wife that he wasn't taking any chances, that he would be well prepared in case the worst were to happen on this trip. About 2 weeks later, he's in Colorado and he heads to a ski shop where he rents a split snowboard as well as loads up on all the supplies that you might need for being in the outdoors. Early the next day, Jim and his friends arrive at the trailhead. Jim, in his backpack, had his cell phone. He also had an extra cell phone battery. He had a great GPS. In addition, he had loads of food and water. He had his split snowboard. He has his avalanche beacon. He's got extra clothing. I mean, this guy is well outfitted for this trip. So they start on this hike, and by 10 a.m. that morning, the rest of the group is feeling tired and wants to take a break. Jim doesn't want to take a break. He's in amazing shape and he wants to keep going. So he says, hey guys, I'm going to walk just a little bit farther up and I'll meet you at our next planned stop. No one bats an eye because Jim is like this total stud. He knows what he's doing. And they're like, all right, go ahead. We'll see you up there. Once the group is well rested, they stand back up and they keep walking. They get to that first stop and Jim's not there. They think, okay, we were sitting there for a little while. I'm sure he just went to the next planned stop, because they had planned stops all along the route. The trail they were on, because it had snowed significantly that winter and lots of people had been on this trail, the trail itself was totally packed down to the dirt. So it was very easy to identify this trail. Anywhere there wasn't trail was covered in snow. And so if you were walking this trail, it would be really easy to stay on it. Also, if you were to deviate from the trail and start walking away, it would be really obvious because people would see your footprints leaving the trail. But as Jim's friends are making their way up this trail and not seeing Jim at each of these subsequent stops, they don't see any footprints leaving the trail. So they just figure he must have gone all the way to the end. He's just way ahead of us. But by 5 p.m., when they made it all the way up to the top where they planned on stopping and turning around, Jim wasn't there, and they hadn't passed him on the way up, and they hadn't seen any footprints or any ski tracks or anything to indicate that someone had left the path. And so very worried about Jim, they called the authorities. Over the next 5 days, a massive search is launched in this area, including 3 helicopters that scoured an 18-mile square radius. They had scent sniffing dogs out there. They had all these very experienced mountaineers combing the area, but they couldn't find any sign of him. And again, because of all the snow outside of that trail they were on, the helicopter just searched up and down that trail looking for indications that someone had left the trail, looking for those footprints or ski tracks just off that trail they were on, and there weren't any. There was no sign that anyone had left the trail at any point. Yet Jim was gone. The authorities, friends, family, everybody's baffled. But they're thinking to themselves, Jim's a really competent outdoorsman. He has a working GPS, And they checked their cell phones. That whole area they were in, they had cell phone reception. So they're thinking to themselves, we don't know what's going on, but I'm sure he's going to turn up at some point. 20 days after Jim went missing, his body is discovered by two hikers 7 kilometers away from the trail he had been on when he went missing. He had died from significant head trauma as well as a broken femur. It looked like he had fallen from a really great height, but it wasn't entirely clear where he had actually fallen from. He was found with just leggings and a shirt on, no jacket and no boots, and his boots were nowhere to be found. His backpack was next to him, and inside of it was his GPS that worked and his cell phone that worked. He even had an extra battery for his cell phone, yet at no point had he tried to use his cell phone over the duration of the time he had been out there. He also had lots of food and water and additional clothing. He had a tent, but it looked like none of it had been touched since he packed it originally. And then strangest of all is there were no footprints or ski tracks leading up to either where he was or any of the surrounding areas. There were no tracks to show how he actually got where he got. It's as if he had been lifted off the trail 7 kilometers away and dropped where he was. When the exact location of where he was found was communicated back to the authorities, the helicopter pilots who had been involved in that initial 5-day search said that we looked at that area multiple times and he wasn't there. So at some point after those 5 days, Jim had found a way to land 7 kilometers away in this random place where there's no footprints that lead to it, no tracks, no anything. We know he had a working cell phone and a working GPS, and we know that he didn't make it to this spot where he ultimately was found in the first 5 days. So at a minimum, what was he doing in those first 5 days? Why wasn't he using his cell phone to communicate what was going on? Why wasn't he using his GPS to get back to safety? Why didn't he use the supplies in his backpack to save his life? Why did he take his boots off? And then how did he wind up in the location he was in? Because there was no tracks that would have led to that spot. In 1958, Bobby Bisup was a 10-year-old living in Colorado. He was almost completely deaf, so he wore a hearing aid, and he came from a family that was devoutly Catholic. That summer, Bobby's family decided to send him to a Catholic camp for boys. It was located at the St. Malo Church inside of Rocky Mountain National Park. The camp itself was situated at the base of Mount Meeker. Anytime the boys were up the mountain, which was pretty steep, they could always look down and see this camp. In addition, there was this stream that fed right by the camp. So if they could just get to the stream anytime they were up in the mountain, they could follow it all the way down and get back to the camp. This was something that they told all of the boys in case they got lost up in the mountain. On August 15th, around 6 p.m., Bobby was a little ways up from the camp fishing along that river. And one of the camp counselors was making his way up to try to get all the boys to come back down for dinner. This camp counselor would say that he clearly saw Bobby recognize that it was time to come back down, it was time for dinner. He clearly saw Bobby turn and start walking down towards the camp, at which point the counselor turned his back on Bobby and he too began walking down towards the camp, which was not very far away. When the counselor got to the camp and turned back around though, Bobby was gone. And so the counselor starts immediately tracing his steps back to try to find Bobby, but he can't find him anywhere. The counselor goes and gets a number of the other counselors to come help him find Bobby. After about 30 minutes, no sign of Bobby. He's just gone. The camp counselors are looking around thinking, how is this possible? He was literally right there. He started walking, he was right behind me. How could he have gotten lost in such a short amount of time and in an area where he could literally see the camp and was actually on the river that leads right back to the camp? It didn't make any sense. The counselors alerted authorities and this massive search is launched to find Bobby. Over 300 people come out, including people from the military. It's this huge search and nothing is found of this boy. He's completely gone. 10 days after he went missing, they had to call off the search because there was absolutely no sign of this child. Even after the search ended, many of the camp counselors continued to, in their off time, scour the area around the camp to look for Bobby. And a year later, 3 camp counselors would actually find him. 3 camp counselors decided to go to a very hard to access area that had been searched previously, but they felt like it was the one spot that needed a little bit more attention. And it was 5 kilometers west of the camp and almost 800 yards up a fairly steep incline. This is a hard to access area, but they climbed their way up there, and sure enough, even though this area had been searched before, they found Bobby's hearing aid, bits of his clothing, and some of his bones. They didn't find any more of his remains, and no one knows what actually happened to him. But it really makes you wonder, What happened after the camp counselor turned his back on Bobby? It's as if someone scooped him up and flew him away. And even if he had intentionally run away, it would have been very difficult for a 10-year-old to get to that particular location where he was found. And to what end? Why would he have wanted to get up there? And so, like many of the other missing 411 cases, we are left with a series of questions and very few answers. So I'd love to get your theories as to what's causing these strange disappearances, and I'll do my best to get back to as many people as I can. So if you enjoyed today's stories, I would encourage you, if you have not already, to sneak into the Like Button's house and replace all of their family pictures with pictures of Steve Buscemi. Also, please subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly 3 to 4, even 5 video uploads. If you're interested in learning more about the missing 411 phenomenon, I provided links below to David Paulides and his team. If you have story suggestions for this channel, I have a subreddit called MrBallen's. It's linked below in the description, and you can just drop your story suggestions right in there. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I'm also very active on TikTok, where my handle is MrBallen. So whether I see you on Reddit, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, some combination, I just really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it, guys. Something very strange seems to be going on inside of national parks in North America. Every year, hundreds of people go missing in these parks, but these parks are huge expanses of wilderness. So it's not particularly unusual that people might go missing inside of them. But every year, of those hundreds of people that go missing, there's always a few that go missing under very strange circumstances. Either the way in which they disappeared doesn't really add up. Someone will be watching or keeping an eye on someone, they'll turn around and then turn back and that person's missing and there's not a trace of them and they're never found again. Or you'll have instances of someone will go missing, there'll be an extensive search, there's no trace of them, and then they're found like miles and miles away in locations that are almost impossible to get to. Now, one man, David Paulides, who's a former police detective, he began researching these very strange disappearances inside of national parks. It started when a park ranger actually approached him and said, "Hey, there's a bunch of weird things happening in state parks. You should look into it because you're a former detective." And so after looking into it, he discovered that there were so many oddities around many of these strange disappearances. And he saw there was many overlaps and similarities that he really dove into it. And he's examined thousands of these strange cases. By his count, 10,000 plus hours of research. He's written 4 books. They're all under the name Missing 411. If you Google Missing 411, you'll find a plethora of information about these cases. He has 2 documentaries out. And so David, while he doesn't actually take a stance as to, what's causing these strange disappearances, anybody that follows along with the Missing 411 cases is basically led to believe that something is hunting humans in North America inside of national parks. It is fascinating, it is terrifying, and I've picked out 5 of the most bizarre cases that I've come across inside of Missing 411. Before we get into those 5 stories though, if this is the type of content that you're interested in, the strange, dark, and mysterious that I've kind of promised in this video, well, that's what my channel is all about. And I post 3 to 4 times a week. And so if that's your style and you like that type of content, if you could, please gently lambast the like button and then please turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into the stories. On Father's Day weekend, 1969, 6-year-old Dennis Martin, his brother, his father, and his grandfather headed up to the Smoky Mountains to go camping. This was a family tradition on Father's Day, and they were really excited about it. They get to the same campsite they always used, they set up, they have a wonderful first night, they camp out, and the next day, another camper in the area happened to walk by and saw that Dennis and his brother were playing there. And so this camper had kids as well, and he asked Dennis's father, "Hey, would it be okay if I brought my kids by? They're the same age as your sons, and they can just play together." Dennis's father says, "Sure, bring them down." And so the man goes, gets his kids, they come back, and before long, all the kids are playing hide and seek. Now, Dennis's father would say that he had an eye on Dennis the whole time. He was just at a distance, but watching his son to make sure he didn't get lost. And so at one point, all the kids are hiding from the parents. And, at some point the parents say, "Okay, show yourselves." And all the kids, except for Dennis, show themselves. And Dennis's father has watched Dennis go behind a particular tree. He watched him do it. He was watching the whole time. And so when they said, come on out, and he didn't come out, he actually wasn't that concerned because he knew exactly where his son was. And then after a few moments, he yelled to his son directly and starts walking over and says, Dennis, come out, Dennis, I know you're behind the tree. And when he finally got over there, Dennis wasn't there. Dennis's father immediately starts running off into the woods, screaming for his son. And he actually ends up running almost 2 miles up the Appalachian Trail, just hollering for his son, and he can't find him. And then the rest of the family had broken up and was searching the area because they're thinking, like, he couldn't have gone very far. He was literally just here. And Dennis's father had said before, like, I watched him go behind the tree. I watched him. I don't know where he is, but I watched him go behind the tree. And so they're searching everywhere, and Dennis is gone. So a huge search, in fact, the biggest search in park history ensues, with 1,500 searchers that included the Army Green Berets, so the special forces got involved. They are combing a 60 square mile plot. They're looking everywhere, and there is nothing. There is no trace. There's no scent. There is nothing connected to Dennis Martin anywhere. And so they go back to Dennis's father, and they're like, you have to tell us what you saw. Again, this doesn't add up. If you were looking at the tree and he was right there, how is it that he has just vanished into thin air? But no one knew. That was it. No one knows what happened. There's no closure. He's just gone, and they never knew what happened to him. Years later, when David Paulides was doing his research for Missing 411 and was researching the Dennis Martin case, he interviewed other families that had been at the campground at the same time that Dennis had gone missing. And one of those families was the Key family. And they had asked a park ranger where they could go on the campground where they might be able to see some bears. And so the park ranger obviously said, be careful, but you can go over here to this section of the campground and you might see a bear. And so they head over there and they're looking for bears. And one of their children hears a scream, or thinks he hears a scream, and kind of directs the family to look in the direction of the scream. And from their vantage point, they could see up onto the side of this mountain where there was, call it sparse trees all over the mountain, so you could kind of see in between the trees. And they saw what looked like a bear running along the mountainside, but with something slung over its shoulder. Except the interesting thing about this bear was the father was quoted as saying that it didn't really act like a bear. It was acting more like a human the way it was running. It looked hairy and like an animal, but it was running and dodging between trees. It was holding this, what looked like a child over its shoulder. It acted almost like a human. And so you have a bear man that has been spotted by the Key family, and they bring this up to the investigators that are looking into the Dennis Martin case. And obviously the Dennis Martin investigators, they don't take this seriously. They think that they're just, saying some ridiculous thing for attention or whatever it is. So, it never really was entered into the case with Dennis Martin. It wasn't until the Missing 411 cases that it was ever connected. But there really was a family that claims to have seen a bear man carrying a child about an hour after Dennis Martin had gone missing in the same area where Dennis Martin had gone missing. In the spring of 1952, 2-year-old Keith Parkins was playing with his siblings outside of his grandfather's ranch in Ritter, Oregon. And when the kids were all called in to have lunch, Keith was nowhere to be found. And so the siblings and the family went out and did a cursory search looking for Keith. And when nothing turns up, they call in authorities and a full-fledged search is launched for Keith. There's no sign, there's nothing. And 4 miles away from the ranch, they find several hours later some footprints that look like they might belong to a 2-year-old. And they start tracking those footprints, and they go on for miles and miles, and then they just kind of stop. And it wouldn't be until the next day, 12 miles away from the ranch, that they would ultimately find Keith. Surprisingly, Keith, who had disappeared with not enough clothing to be out in sub-zero temperatures with snow on the ground and being 2 years old, he wasn't prepared for a night out. He was found alive, face down, 12 miles away. His jacket and his hat had been stacked neatly next to him, and he had scratch marks all over his face, but he was unhurt. When asked, what happened, he was 2 years old, he had said a cat scratched him. and he kept repeating that a cat had scratched him. It was the only thing that he could articulate. No one knew how a 2-year-old, in the span of 20 hours, could have moved in the middle of the night 12 miles away. Les Stroud, who's a very accomplished outdoorsman, the star, he is Survivor Man, he actually, because of this case, went out and tried to actually cover the distance in the allotted time. He had 20 hours to cover this 12 miles, and he couldn't do it. And he even said, like, it's not possible for a 2-year-old to have covered this distance, let alone survived the exposure to the elements in the time that he was out there. But somehow he did. And years and years later, Keith was interviewed, because now he's a grown man, he was interviewed about what happened, and he has no idea. He has no memory of it. At the end of 1973, 19-year-old Charles McCullough, who was an amateur photographer, had been doing a West Coast tour of the United States, going to all the different national parks to photograph beautiful scenery. And by January of 1974, he was in Oregon and wanted to go to Crater Lake, where he wanted to take pictures of Crater Lake. So he asked his friend, who had an all-terrain vehicle, to take him out to Crater Lake, because his van, which was this VW beat-up old van, it couldn't have made it out that far. And as his friend is driving him out to Crater Lake, Charles says to him, kind of jokingly, "Yeah, if you don't hear from me in a couple of days, file a missing person report." Sure enough, a couple days later, when Charles doesn't show up, that friend does file a missing person report, and an extensive search is conducted at Crater Lake to find Charles. There's no sign of Charles. There's nothing. There's no anything about Charles. And his father actually flew out there and stayed for several months, just constantly searching the area, found nothing. So nothing is found. So a year later, a couple of backpackers were hiking the area around Crater Lake, and they get lost. They take a wrong turn, and they're well off the trailhead, and they discover a backpack. In the backpack, they found a strange-looking Volkswagen key that anyone that knew Charles McCullough knew that he had this strange key. And so when they found it, it was a distinctive key. And so when they gave it to police, it turned out that it was Charles McCullough's backpack. So investigators went out and started looking in the area that this backpack was found, which was 12 miles off the trailheads. This is well off the trailhead. And near the backpack, they find what remained of Charles McCullough. So they found his pants unbuttoned and on a log, as if he was sitting on the log and then just disappeared into the ground. But his pants were still there. Sticking out of the pants were his socks, no shoes, and in the socks were his feet bones. There was no jacket, there was no upper portion of his skeleton. 12 feet away, they find a portion of his skull. And that is the last thing they find of Charles McCullough. And ultimately, it was determined that he died of natural causes. His family was not prepared to accept that, however, when you look at some of the circumstances. We have, he's missing his jacket, he's missing his boots, he's missing his photography equipment, his head is detached from his body. He was also 12 miles off the trailhead, and when he went missing, there had been approximately 5 to 7 feet of snow that had dumped in the area. So how did he move 12 miles off the trailhead in 7 feet of snow, especially when you consider he was not an outdoorsy type, and even when he got dropped off by his friend that drove him out there, he even said later on that he felt like Charles was very ill-equipped for the environment he was going into. But at the end of the day, it was left as, sorry, he went missing and he died of natural causes, and that was that. Bart Schleyer was a famous outdoorsman and hunter. He was just one of those people that you could drop into any environment and he's not only going to survive, he's going to thrive. A testament to that would be he spent months in Siberia tracking and catching Siberian tigers. He was like a world-renowned tiger tracker. He's just like this super rugged, super competent outdoorsman. In September of 2004, Bart books a float plane to take him 175 miles north into the Yukon Territory in Canada for him to go hunt moose on his own for 3 weeks. He had all the right equipment, he was obviously extremely capable, and no one thought twice about it. When he got dropped off, he told the pilot, "Meet me back here in 3 weeks." And so off he went. The plane leaves and comes back 3 weeks later, and there's no Bart. Now the pilot knew Bart was like a god in the wilderness, and so he wasn't really concerned, but he went over to where he had been told his campsite would be, and he found the campsite. and it looked like someone was still living there. It didn't look like it had been destroyed at all. And then near his campsite, he found a dry bag, which looked like it had an indent on it where someone might have been sitting on it up against a tree. And then next to the tree was his bow and some arrows. And it looked like an area where a hunter might have been sitting to call in moose, but there was no Bart. Near the dry bag and the bow and arrow, they found Bart's teeth and a couple of shards of bone. Initially, the thought is, well, a large predator must have snuck up on Bart and eaten him. Except there's a couple of huge problems with that theory. One, Bart, his friends at least would say, and people that knew him would say, he would never get snuck up on by a large predator. He was so accomplished in the wilderness, like he was always a step ahead of everything around him. So the idea that he would just be sitting there one day and a bear would just happen to sneak up on him is pretty far-fetched. Also, in the area where his teeth and some of his bones were found, there was no sign of what they call a death struggle, where you're fighting for your life, you're smashing into everything. There's none of that. There's no marking on the ground or in the surrounding areas that a large predator had attacked him. Also, his camp had food out in the open, and if a large predator had come through like a bear, after it finished with Bart, it would have raided the campsite, and it didn't. And so the way this was left was he was attacked and eaten by a predator. But nobody believes that because that wouldn't happen to Bart, and the circumstances around his campsite didn't really add up. In 2002, Christopher Tompkins was working as a surveyor, and he was assigned to this 4-man survey crew that was working in Harris County, Georgia. And they were walking along this road spaced about 50 feet apart, all 4 of them. And Chris was the last one in line. And the third one in line would later tell investigators and police that as they were walking along the road, he would periodically turn around to just, for a quick second, make sure Chris was still there. And as they're walking along with no sound or any indication that anything's happened, he turned around, saw Chris, kept walking. A few minutes later, turned around, and Chris is gone. The third guy hails the other 2, and they go, and they're like, where did Chris go? They're looking down the road, like maybe he stopped, maybe he stepped off the trail, but they can't see him. And they go back they start walking down the road towards where he would have been, and they find on the ground a pile of loose change and some of his tools that would have been in his pockets. And then they see one of his boots stuck in the barbed wire, because there was a little barbed wire fence that was running the length of this road. One of his boots was stuck in the barbed wire, and there was nothing else. They search the area, they're looking everywhere, there's no sign of him, and it didn't make any sense to the people in this survey crew, especially the guy who was third in line. He was like, I literally saw him a minute ago, and there's no way he could have gotten away without me hearing or seeing some indication of where he was, but there was no sign of him, and he was gone. So after this huge investigation, they don't find any sign of him, and that's it. They're just like, yeah, he's gone. They did find, 9 months later, they found his other boot near a swamp 900 yards away, but it didn't provide any more clarity into what happened to him. However, if you look at the pile of loose change and things that were in his pockets that were on the road, it indicates that at some point he may have been turned upside down. And if you think about the entirety of all of these strange stories where the idea being someone could be hunting humans, just picture in your head Chris Tompkins walking along and something flipping him upside down, dumping the contents out, and then being gone in a matter of a minute where no one can see where they went. These 5 stories are just a fraction of the literal thousands of others that are covered in the Missing 411 series. And while many people believe that all of the cases in Missing 411 and any others that ultimately are considered strange inside of these national parks have a rational explanation, even if we don't know what it is. Whereas another group believes that this Missing 411 phenomenon is an indication that something is hunting humans in the national parks across North America. Some say Bigfoot, some say aliens, some say something else. But paranormal is certainly the other camp in terms of trying to explain away what these strange disappearances are from or what's causing them. Whether or not we ever find a definitive conclusion remains to be seen, but I would love to hear what you think is going on inside of these strange cases of missing 411, whether it's a rational explanation or maybe something paranormal or some other option. But I'd love to hear what you have to say in the comments. And that's going to do it, guys. If you enjoyed this, please, if you could, gently lambast the like button and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my 3 to 4 weekly uploads every week. If you want to get in touch with me, please DM me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. Also, I'm very active on TikTok, and my username is MrBallen over there as well. And that's going to do it, guys. Until next time, take care. Every year, hundreds of people go missing inside of national parks all over North America. But of those hundreds of people every year, a few of them go missing under very strange circumstances. And a man named David Paulides, who's a former police detective, has made it his mission to look into just the bizarre disappearances that are occurring all over North America in his series that's called Missing 411. So there are thousands of these strange cases inside of Missing 411 that David Paulides has poured tens of thousands of hours of research into. And he puts them into books, into documentaries. And so there's really no shortage of strange cases to look at. But as I begin my own research into Missing 411 and learn about these different cases, I have been pulling groups of stories that stand out to me as being particularly interesting or just fascinating or just strange, and I'm making videos to highlight those stories. And so I've already done one video like this where I highlighted 5 stories that I thought were particularly strange. You can find that in the description. I left a link to that video if you want to check that out. And so today I'm going to be looking at another 5 cases from the Missing 411 project that are just totally weird. But before we get into today's stories, if you're interested in the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you've come to the right channel, because I post 3 to 4 times a week all about the strange, dark, and mysterious, like I'm promising to deliver today. And if that's your deal, I would ask you to please gently uppercut the like button, and then also subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of those 3 to 4 weekly uploads. All right, let's get into the story. So this first one really takes the cake for just being strange. You have a family that basically has 2 experiences that are somewhat connected. You're gonna have to be the judge if they're connected or not, but very strange. On October 1st of 2010, this family, who decided to remain anonymous for the Missing 411 story, they go camping, and it's a 3.5-year-old boy, his older sister, and then the mom and the dad. And so they go camping at Mount Shasta in California, which is a popular camping site. And the family loved to go camping there. And so they're all sitting around the campfire, kind of hanging out at the campsite. It's getting late in the evening, maybe 5, 6 o'clock. And the sister would say that she was looking at her brother, turned away for a second, and then looked back, and he was gone. And it was so sudden that she actually went to go look for him and couldn't find him. So she went and told her mom and her dad, and they start calling for their son, and they're looking all over their campsite, and he's gone. Authorities show up, and they launch a full search. And for 5 hours, they have hundreds of people scouring this area, not only the campsite, but the surrounding areas, and there's no trace of this boy. 5 hours later, they find him laying in a thicket on a trail that had been searched multiple times. And it wasn't like hidden. The thicket was like right by the side of the trail. So if you've searched this trail, you've found this kid. So meaning he couldn't have been there during the search. He must have arrived and then they found him on this trail. Everybody was so happy that they found this kid and he wasn't physically harmed that no one really looked into the fact that it doesn't make any sense that he is here. How did he get here? Where did he go? Where has he been? No one thought about that. They were like, we got the kid back. We're all happy. The parents are happy. Everyone's ready to just move on. And so the kid goes to the hospital. The doctor looks at the kid and says, you know what? He's fine. This is obviously a traumatic situation, but he's fine. You can take him home. And so the kid goes home with his parents, and pretty quickly the family went back to normal. They were obviously super grateful that they didn't lose their son. About 3 weeks after this whole ordeal, the boy is with his grandmother, who he called Cappy, and he looks at Cappy and he goes, I don't like the other Cappy. And so his grandmother, the real Cappy, she looks at him and she was like, what do you mean? Now, remember, this is a 3.5-year-old boy. Language skills not the best, okay? But this story that he tells his grandmother, he had previously told his father, but the father had written it off as the ramblings of a 3.5-year-old. It wasn't until the grandmother told the father about the story that he was like, I've heard that story. And so the boy says, while he was camping, he turned and he saw Cappy waving to him to come with him. And so he loves Cappy and he goes with Cappy, and Cappy leads him up a hill to a cave. Now the whole time, the real Cappy, who wasn't there, she was not with them camping, she's thinking, oh my God, someone who looks like me abducted this child. So she's listening, horrified. He said, she brought me up to a cave. And when we got into the cave, he said there were spiders and purses, like women's purses. And he turned to look at Cappy, and he said that her head was glowing. And it was when he realized this is not Cappy. This is the other Cappy. And he said the other Cappy kept asking him questions, but he didn't know the answers. And so the other Cappy got frustrated and told him to leave and pushed him out of the cave. And he said that he left the cave and wound up in the thicket, and that's when he was found. And so when Cappy goes and tells the father, and the father says, I've heard that story, they're like, that's so weird. Do you think there's any truth to this? Is there someone that looked like me, Cappy, that took the boy away? And so as Cappy and the boy's father are talking, Cappy feels compelled to share her own strange story about being on Mount Shasta, because prior to this, the family, I think the way they were looking at what happened is the boy wandered off and he returned 5 hours later. But with the boy's story being kind of corroborated by, the father who heard the same story, Cappy's like, I gotta share my story now because I don't know if it's connected, but I had a very strange experience on Mount Shasta as well a year ago. She went camping a year earlier with her friend, and they go to a campsite on Mount Shasta, the same place where the boy disappeared, and apparently saw the other Cappy. And so Cappy says that night, they're sitting around the campfire and it's dark, and she notices a set of eyes in the woods that were glowing. So glowing red eyes, she says. And, Cappy and her friend, they go camping all the time. And so they know there could be predators and animals all over the place. And so they grab their flashlights and they shine in the direction of the eyes, and the eyes dart away and they don't think anything of it. Over the course of the night, the eyes would keep showing up all around them. And every time they'd shine a light in their direction, they would vanish. Cappy and her friend are unable to get the light on this thing. They don't know what it is. And so they're very uneasy about it. But they decide, you know what? We're psyching ourselves out. It's just an animal that's interested in us. And so they go to bed and they sleep in their own. She slept in a tent and he slept in a camper, and they go to bed. And the next morning, Cappy wakes up and she's laying on the dirt outside of her tent. And immediately she has pain in the back of her neck. And so she reaches back and she grabs her neck, and she can feel there's a cut on the back of her neck. She doesn't know what it is, and she looks up, and her friend is on the ground outside of his camper, face down as well. And so she gets up, she feels horrible, like sick, like violently sick, in fact, and she kind of staggers away over to her friend who is laying there, and she can see too that he's got a mark on his neck, and he gets up and he's like, what happened? And they assumed that they had been bitten by, a poisonous spider. That's actually what they believed, because it was a little puncture wound on both of their necks, and that it had caused them to be sick and delirious. They'd wandered out of their camper and their tent, and they'd wound up on the ground. But now, as Cappy is retelling the story, she was like, I don't know how to connect that experience with what happened to the boy, but I can't help but feel like something weird's happening on Mount Shasta. And it would turn out that, maybe they weren't wrong, because Mount Shasta is like a hotspot for missing 411 strange disappearances. And in fact, our next story is another Mount Shasta case. In 1999, Carl Landers was a very experienced hiker, climber, whose passion in life was, on the weekends or any chance he got, was to go hiking and climbing and camping. That was just what he did. He was in great shape. He was enjoying retirement. That was his happy place, is being on a mountain somewhere in California hiking around. And he had two very close friends that he would go hiking with just about every chance he could. In 1999, in the summer, Carl decides he wants to summit Mount Shasta. And it's something he had attempted to do before, and he had been unsuccessful, and this time he was going to do it. And so Mount Shasta, it's high enough, it's about 14,000 feet, that it's not uncommon for people to stop to this point called Lake Helen, where, you know, hikers can adjust to the altitude, because it's certainly possible to get sick from being at altitude if you don't adjust to it, or if your body doesn't respond well to it. And so their plan was get to Lake Helen, camp out for the night, and then summit the next day. They head up in May of 1999, the three of them. They get to Lake Helen and they set up their camp for the night. It was clear that Carl already had some sort of altitude sickness, because by the time they reach Lake Helen, he's weak, he's sick, and he figures, I'm going to try to sleep it off tonight. I'll see how I feel in the morning. And so all night, Carl is just super sick. It's a horrible night for him. And so early the next morning, Carl, he's a real stubborn guy and he really wanted to climb Mount Shasta. He says to his two friends, hey, look, I'm just going to get a head start here. I've been up basically all night. I'm going to just get up the last stretch here, summit this mountain, and then come back down and be done with it. And so his two friends, they didn't like the idea of splitting up, but Carl's an experienced guy. And I mean, he's only covering a distance of maybe 650 feet. Like, this is not some epic distance he's covering. It's basically like a day hike. So Carl leaves on his own. He leaves his backpack at the campsite, and his two friends would watch him as he kind of bent around the mountain and went up towards the summit, and that would be the last time they ever saw him. The two friends would attempt to summit as well about 30 minutes later. One of them apparently had gotten sick overnight and said, look, I can't do this, and he stays at the camp. He's like, I'll be here. You know, we've already split up from Carl. Why don't you also go on your own, summit yourself, and I'll be here. I'll wait for Carl. I'll wait for you. The friend that does make the summit, he goes up, he follows the same trail, this short distance up to the summit, gets to the summit, and he hasn't seen Carl. He's not shocked. It is a little strange that they wouldn't have passed on the way, but he's thinking, you know, anything could have happened. Maybe he sat down somewhere, I don't know what it is, and then comes back down expecting to see Carl back at the campsite. So he gets back to the campsite at Lake Helen, where the other sick friend had not left. He was still there. And he says, hey, has Carl come back? And the friend's like, no, didn't you see him on the way up? Did you laugh him? Like, what's he doing up there? And he was like, no, I went up. I didn't see him on the way up. I didn't see him at the summit, and I didn't see him on the way down. And they're thinking to themselves, like, thinking about the trail itself. It's incredibly open. There's almost nowhere to like fall. There's no crevasse. There's no sheer cliff. You know, there's almost no vegetation really to obscure you. It just didn't make any sense that you could vanish. A huge search is launched. They never found anything. There was also 50 to 100 people in the area that day, and nobody knew where he went. No one saw him. No one had any idea what happened to him. They interviewed everybody there. No one knows what happened to Carl. The only clue that we have of Carl is the backpack that he left at Lake Helen before he made the summit run. Other than that, for 20 years, we have no clue what happened to him. None. So this next story is really creepy. One of the strange phenomenons that you get inside of these missing 411 stories is you have people that go missing really suddenly, like as if they were pulled away at high speed and just ripped off the face of the mountain. And this story is one of those stories. In 2010, Eric Lewis was 57 years old. He was an extremely experienced mountain climber, and he had two very close friends that were also very experienced mountain climbers. And they decided that they wanted to go hike Mount Rainier in Washington State, which is a huge mountain. And they were doing a climb that was fairly technical and fairly dangerous, and it required the three of them to be tethered together on the same cable. And so as they're making this ascent of Mount Rainier, you have friend one in the front, friend two in the middle, and then Eric Lewis is the third guy on the line all the way down. And so the way it worked is the first climber, friend number one, if he wanted to rest, the other two climbers would keep climbing up to his position and take a rest with him. So he was kind of in charge of setting the cadence of how quickly they were going to climb this mountain. And so over the course of the day, the first climber would stop periodically, and then the second climber and Eric would make their way up and wait and relax. All day that was happening. And then one time they come to a stop, and there's been nothing weird happening. Nothing's happened to this point. Everything feels very normal. The first guy stops, the second climber gets up to him, and then Eric doesn't show up. And so they pull on the line, and it's very light. And they pull it up, and the rope has been cut. Like, Eric's gone. And they're like, okay, only in an emergency would you cut the line. And so they just start immediately descending because they're like, well, it just snowed. It'll be very easy to track his footsteps. If he cut the line, he must have had a reason. Let's follow his footsteps to wherever he went. But the only footsteps on the mountain were the ones walking up, attached to the rope. Basically, Eric had been walking up, leaving footprints right behind the other two, and then the footprints just stopped. There aren't footprints that go back down. It was like he was pulled off of the mountain. And so they start walking down, thinking they're gonna run into him, but they don't. The weather gets bad enough that they ultimately abandon the hike. They go down, and they're like, geez. They tell the authorities, and they're looking everywhere, and they can't find him. And then they discover this creepy cave that's like 200 feet down and away from where they were hiking. That would have been very hard to get to. Inside of this ice cave is Eric's gear. No Eric. And they've never found Eric's body. But for that gear to get into the cave, it wasn't just, hanging on the edge. It was inside the cave. So there's no footprints leading to the cave. There's no footprints anywhere. It's just like inexplicably, Eric's gear winds up deep inside an ice cave 200 feet away, and Eric's body was never recovered, and no one has any idea what happened there. So the last story is actually really two distinct stories, but they together make up a particular phenomenon that occurs inside some of these missing 411 cases, and that's when some creature takes a child and actually protects them. In 1868, a 3-year-old girl vanished abruptly from her father's camp in northern Michigan. The father noticed the girl was gone, in hysterics. He enlists the help of a couple professional hunters that were there with him. They go off looking for this girl, and after a couple of hours of looking, they start to hear what sounds like her voice. And she doesn't sound particularly distraught, but it's definitely a child's voice. And so they kind of cut through this big thicket, and out bursts this massive bear-looking thing that runs away from them. And they didn't shoot it or anything. They just saw this huge animal run away, and they're thinking the worst because they're hearing this child, and now they're seeing this huge animal that looks like a bear running away. And they go through the thicket, and they find this girl who's totally unharmed, who was in this kind of clearing within the thicket where clearly this bear creature had been with her. And the father's elated. He scoops up the child, and the child seems unhurt, and he asks her, like, where have you been? What happened? And she says, oh, Mr. Wolf took me here, and Mr. Wolf was feeding me berries, and Mr. Wolf was playing with me. Maybe it was a bear or a wolf or something, but some animal had taken her, brought her into a thicket, and had not harmed her. And so the other instance occurred in 1955 when a family that was made up of mother, father, and their 8 kids were staying in this camp in Montana. And they had all these different tents set up for all their kids. And some of the older kids were staying in one of the tents with their 2-year-old sister, Ida Mae, while the parents were working and the kids were doing whatever they were doing. And so these older kids are sitting deep inside the tent, and near the entrance to the tent is where Ida Mae, the 2-year-old, is sitting. And the tent is open, like the flap is open to the tent. And as they're sitting there, the older kids would later say that a bear wandered past, reached in, grabbed Ida Mae, and scooped her up into its arm. Now, a bear does not do this with its arm, but they described it like this. The bear was holding Ida like this and ran away on 3 legs instead of 4. And so the kids are freaked out because they just saw a bear take their 2-year-old away. They're basically hysterical. They sprint up to their mom and dad. They tell them what happened. And the parents just have no idea how to react to this. They obviously get in touch with authorities. They launch the search. And as they're doing the search, police are asking the kids, like, describe to us again what you saw. And they're like, it was a bear that was like holding our sister like this. And they were like, you got to be more descriptive because bears can't do that. Was it a person? Was it a hairy person? And the police just didn't buy that it was a bear. And so 2 days go by and they haven't found this child. And so the family obviously is thinking the worst. They're absolutely grief-stricken. And then one of the searchers finds the girl. And they find her about 300 yards away from the camp. She was inside of a very intentionally built structure. There's a crudely built fort right against the riverbed. And inside it was like a den, and she was in there, and she was totally unharmed, and she was perfectly fine. And they take her out, and they ask her, like, what happened? And she's 2. But she says, Mr. Bear fed me berries. Mr. Bear kept me here. Mr. Bear cuddled me. that's all we have. We don't know what this creature was, what bear is able to pull its arm in like this, but she felt totally unthreatened by it, and to this day we don't really know if that was a bear or something else, but whatever it was, it didn't harm Ida, and Ida never felt threatened by it. These stories are just a fraction of the literal thousands of strange cases that David Paulides covers in his Missing 411 project. So if you enjoyed this video and you might want to see more content just like this, I would encourage you to gently uppercut the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my 3 to 4 weekly uploads of content just like this. So if you want to get in touch with me, you can message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I'm also very active on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen over there. I go live on TikTok almost every day of the week at around 10 p.m. Eastern. So I hope to see you on other platforms or on YouTube or all of them. But either way, I really appreciate your support. And that's going to do it, guys. Until next time, talk to you later. After 3 years of intense military training, I had become a Navy SEAL, joined my first SEAL team, which was SEAL Team 2 in Virginia. And I had joined my platoon, my 25-man platoon. We had gone through all this additional training at the team to prepare for deployment. And here I was, 3 years to the day, almost exactly, from when I went to boot camp, getting ready to deploy as a Navy SEAL to Afghanistan. But none of that training would prepare me for how intense my first couple of weeks in Afghanistan would be. So the flight to Afghanistan is pretty routine until you enter Afghanistan airspace, when your pilots let you know, hey, you've entered Afghanistan airspace. They turn the lights to red in the inside of the plane, and they get ready to descend very rapidly into the base where we would be landing. You know, we can't afford to be in the air for any longer than we have to be because there's a risk of getting shot. So there's a super steep descent, and then they tell you to stay away from the windows, right? So you're avoiding the windows in case you get shot at. And I remember thinking like, wow, like this is really it. We're here, we're in a war zone. Like we're nosediving into bases to avoid getting shot at. Like it was intense, and I'm in my 20s. Like it was just kind of cool. Then the ramp opened, the back of the plane opened, and we all got out, and we're inside of this very well fortified base, and we're safe in here. And immediately I was struck by the just stunning beauty of the landscape. I remember looking out at all these snow-covered mountains, and I remember thinking like, how is this a war zone? This is one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen. I don't think I really appreciated just how foreign of a place Afghanistan is relative to where I come from. We get out to our site, and that night they wanted to go, they being the team that we were relieving, they wanted us to go on an operation. We were going to be up in the mountains. And I remember distinctly them talking about the cave systems that were in these mountains. And I remember thinking like how creepy that was. We would be up on these mountains, walking around. It's so isolated, it's so foreign, and there could be like people hiding in caves that we could accidentally fall into one of their caves. Like it really, really creeped me out. And so I was talking about how creepy these caves were, and the interpreter was like, you know, what's really creepy is back in 2002, there was this fairly well documented case of another special operations unit, the Army Green Berets, coming in contact with a creature in a cave, and they actually got into a battle with it, and they lost one of their soldiers to this creature. And it was fairly well documented, but then it was quickly kind of silenced. I mean, certainly the story was interesting, but I didn't really believe it. Maybe it was some animal, maybe it was some person, whatever it was, there was some explanation to it. It wasn't until now that I actually started exploring different strange occurrences and strange events, and I looked and found some testimony from one of the soldiers that came forward anonymously, who was a part of this operation where they came in contact with this creature in Kandahar. And what struck me about his testimony is it sounds authentic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell that soldier's story, and I'm going to tell the other kind of corroborating witness stories as well, to try to give you a picture of what happened in Kandahar in 2002, and you can be the judge if you think this is fact or fiction. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's what my channel is all about, and I upload 3 to 4 times a week. So if that interests you, I would encourage you to please gently ravage the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of those 3 to 4 weekly uploads. Alright guys, let's get into the story. In 2002, an Army infantry unit just vanished. They were on patrol in the Kandahar mountain range in Afghanistan, and they stopped using the radios. They stopped calling in. No one knew what was going on. They didn't call in a TIC, which stands for Troops in Contact. Basically, any military unit, if you're out on an operation and you start getting shot at, you radio in to your higher command, hey, troops in contact, or TIC, which signals to them, you need to get aircraft on standby, you need to get ready to send reinforcements, they need to be ready to support you. But they only do that if you signal that you're in a TIC. And it's, a lot of people, if anything, will call it in too early. You know, units are known to call it in almost prematurely sometimes. And so the idea that a unit would vanish without calling in a TIC or any sort of communication about any gunfight or any ambush or anything, it's a little bit strange. And so they disappear. The Army decides that in order to find them, because this is obviously a really big deal, they would get their most elite unit, so the Army Green Berets, that's their very elite special forces, they would send them out to find this missing unit. And so one soldier that was a part of that elite special forces detachment, who just goes by Mr. K, he would come forward years later and tell the story of what happened once they were tasked with this mission. So they leave via helicopters and they fly out to the Kandahar mountain range, about 4 clicks, so 4 kilometers about, from where they believed was this infantry unit's last known location. And so they land and they start doing this fairly methodical search through the mountainside. They knew that they were in enemy territory, and at any time they could get into a gunfight, they could be ambushed. There's all these cave systems all over these mountains. And so it's slow moving to begin with. Plus, they're looking for this lost infantry unit. So it's just a very slow movement through the mountains. And so over the first few days, nothing really happened. They didn't come in contact with the enemy. They didn't see any sign of this missing infantry unit. They just walked along the mountains carrying a bunch of gear, and that was it. At some point, they noticed a little bit farther ahead that there was this distinct pathway leading up the mountain and kind of around the corner. And it looked like a goat trail. There were lots of goats that would run around the mountainside, and it looked like a very well-developed goat trail. And they decided, let's just go up there. If nothing else, we can go up onto wherever this leads us and maybe look down across the other side of the mountain and see if we can see anything. And so the team starts making their way up this goat trail, and as soon as they start making their way up, they start noticing that there are little pieces of American military equipment on the ground. There are pieces of radios, like whip antennas and housing of the actual radio itself. They found military-style backpacks as well, and they started finding pieces of uniforms that belonged to the missing infantry unit. They knew based on the patches that were on these uniforms. So as they're walking up this trail of broken equipment and uniforms, they start seeing some bone on the ground. They didn't know if it was human bone or what. They start seeing broken bones scattered on their way up to this kind of plateau. And so now the Special Forces team, I mean, they're incredibly well trained. I mean, I'm not just being biased here. I mean, the Army Green Berets, the Army Special Forces, they're very similar to the Navy SEAL teams, which I was a part of. 2 different units, no doubt, but very much peers. And the level of training you get in handling situations like this one, now granted this one's pretty unique, you're so well trained that when things start getting dangerous, it's like your training just kicks in, and everybody's does. And so I would imagine that when they saw this, what they were thinking is, this was an ambush. This infantry unit was ambushed, and we're probably coming up on the ambush site. And so they're, taking defensive positions, and they're moving slowly and very tactically up this mountain, and they're keeping their weapons pointed at the leading edge on their way up to the top of this mountain. They get to this plateau. It's like a flat section of the mountain, right? It's like a steep mountain, and there's like this little shelf almost. And there's more equipment scattered and more bones scattered across it. And there's all these cave entrances right in front of them. It's as if they were intentionally placed so that they fed out onto this shelf. And so they start moving towards the mouth of the caves. And they realize, without even getting very close, that even though the mouth of these caves are pretty large and everybody could go into the cave, there is a steep drop-off. Like, you'd walk in and then it just goes straight down. And someone kind of peered over the edge and couldn't see how far it went down. And they decided that it was just too dangerous to go in there, because clearly something happened here where American lives were lost, based on the tattered uniforms and equipment. And so let's just pull back and take up defensive positions looking at the entrance to all of these cave entrances. And so as leadership goes down, kind of out of the fatal funnels, if you will, outside of these caves, Mr. K, who's the guy who's told us this whole story, he said he's looking at one of the entrances to the caves and he sees a flash of movement inside of the cave. And he looks over at it, he doesn't have time to react to it or anything, and all of a sudden a spear comes flying out of the cave, this big, massive lance comes flying out, and it goes right through one of his teammates whose name was Dan. And so Dan's down. And so the whole team saw that. They didn't see who threw it, but they certainly saw the spear hit Dan. And so as they're shocked and just keeping their weapon up, wondering what's going to happen, out runs this, by Mr. K's account, a 12 to 15 foot tall man with a red beard and red hair down past his shoulders, comes charging out, howling like a war cry. He's got animal skins for clothes. He just looks super dirty. And he runs over to Dan to pull the spear out and probably use it again. And the rest of the team at this point is broken out of their shock of what they're seeing, and they start engaging this giant. And the giant didn't really have a chance to fight back, and in 30 seconds the giant is down too. So Dan's down and the giant is down. And the whole team is like, what just happened? So after the dust had settled and all the shooting had stopped, they went to check on Dan, and Dan had passed away. And so they called back into higher headquarters, and they're trying to describe what happened. A very large, possibly human creature threw a projectile that hit Dan. And so they sent 2 helicopters out, one to retrieve Dan and the team, the other just to hoist up this very large human-like creature because they wanted to know what it was. And they struggled mightily to get the netting around this big creature. It ended up weighing over 1,100 pounds. It had 6 toes on each foot and it had 6 fingers on each hand. They load it up, they string it onto this helo, and it takes off. And the team gets into the other helicopter and they go back expecting to be debriefed as soon as they get back to base. The helicopter with the giant would fly to an airfield, and they would meet up with a crew of a C-130, which is another big military aircraft. The pilot of that craft would publicly say that he remembers seeing a 12 to 15 foot tall giant person with 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot. And he would say that's what he saw, even though it was later redacted and made top secret. Mr. K and his team, they flew back to the base to be debriefed. And so they had to provide an after-action report. It's something done in the military. You go out, you do any operation, you come back, and you write up what happened. And so Mr. K and his team decided to just be honest about what they saw. And so they described it again in detail. 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot. It came out, it threw the spear, it hit Dan. It was this horrible situation. And once they submitted it, their leadership said, you got to rewrite that. We're not going to accept that. So Mr. K said they ultimately rewrote it, and it just sounded like a typical engagement in the mountains with the enemy. And it was made top secret, and they never saw it again. And that was it. Mr. K said that he and the rest of his team also had to sign non-disclosure agreements to not ever talk about what they saw. And they never got any word about what actually happened, what did they do with the body of the giant, and they just never got any clarity out of it. It was just basically made top secret, redacted, and they were told don't talk about it. So it would take until 2016 when Mr. K finally just said, you know what, screw it, I'm gonna go public with what I saw because my friend died and they're acting like, this didn't happen, but it did happen. And so that's why we have this detailed report of this mission where they came in contact with the giant of Kandahar. I don't know how I feel about this story. I do think that if there was a place in the world that had the ability to mask or hide giants from being seen by the prying eyes of the human population, it would be Afghanistan. There were times when I was walking around out there that it felt like I was walking around on another planet. But either way, you do have one soldier who was killed by something out in the mountains of Kandahar, and his own teammates say this is what happened. And you have multiple corroborating witness testimony, but a lot of it's been made top secret and redacted, and so we don't really know what happened, or at least us commoners don't know what really happened. So I'd love to hear what you think happened, whether you think this totally happened and it's true, or if you think it was a hoax. If you enjoyed this story, if you would, please gently ravage the like button and then also subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications because I post stories like this one 3 to 4 times a week. And so if that's your deal, well, then you've come to the right place. That's going to do it, guys. If you want to get in touch with me, you can message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I'm also very active on TikTok, where my handle is MrBallen, and you can reach me on there as well. That's going to do it, guys. Take care.